Guten Tag, once again, ladies and gentlemen. When we finished our last session on the Protestant Reformation, we discussed how Martin Luther and his initial break with the Catholic Church, the formation of Lutheranism, was going to spawn a number of other Protestant movements in Western Europe, as others would break with the Catholic Church and sort of move in their own direction for their own interpretation of Christianity. Well, the next two screencasts that we have are going to cover different groups and their breaks with the Church as Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation spreads throughout Western Europe. So today we start the spread of Protestantism, and the focus will just be on different breakaway Protestant groups or individuals in the wake of Martin Luther. And we'll start in Switzerland because this was a real hotbed of Protestantism following Martin Luther. We'll meet a guy named Huldrych Zwingli. We'll figure out who he is, what did he believe, what's the outcome of his reform movement. Also another individual, much more successful than Zwingli, I might add, a guy by the name of John Calvin and his followers, the Calvinists. Who are they? What did they believe? And where did their reform movement ultimately go? Then we'll finish up with a group of people called the Anabaptists, figure out who they are, what makes them even unique to the Protestant movement, what did they believe, how were they viewed by Europeans, Christians and Protestant alike, and as a result, we're going to see a lot of them going somewhere during the 1600s. Where did they go? And when you find out, it might not surprise you all that much. So those are the essential questions. That's where we're headed today. Thus, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so after the rise of Lutheranism in Germany, a number of other Protestant movements began to spark. He's certainly, the first spark, and it's spreading like a fire, if you will, especially in Switzerland. Many preachers in Switzerland break with the Catholic Church and start setting up their own churches that they rather colorfully call Reformed. I mean, what do they want to do? They want to reform the church, hence the name Reformation. So they call their churches Reformed. Well, for a while, the Protestant movement in Switzerland was led by this fellow over there on the left by the name of Huldrych Zwingli. Now, like Martin Luther, he stresses salvation by faith alone. He denounces the Catholic practices like indulgences, has a big problem with the belief in purgatory. Purgatory, if you don't know, in Catholic belief, is sort of like this middle ground. You're not in heaven, but you're not in hell. You're sort of floating around in the middle. Well, he denounces that. And on several occasions, Zwingli and Martin Luther actually met face to face to try to establish some kind of continuity to what the breakaways from the Catholic Church would be, and they never really could agree on anything. So nothing really ever came out of it, and part of it is because, unlike Luther, Zwingli didn't want to just reform from the church, but he wanted to completely break with Catholic tradition and establish his own way of doing things. Eventually, he's going to be able to do this. He wants to establish a theocracy, a religious-based government in the city of Zurich in Switzerland. He achieves this goal by 1525. But see, Switzerland's kind of an odd place at this time. We think of Switzerland as one country, which it was, but it was broken up into a lot of different little states of provinces and nobilities and things like that. And about half of them were Protestant and the other half were Catholic. And in a real foreshadowing of what is very, very much to come in the future, the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants and Catholics simply do not get along with one another, and ultimately it leads to war between the two, political/religious war between the Protestants in Switzerland and the neighboring Catholics. And I'm just going to make a long story very, very short here. In the end, the Catholics are victorious, and Huldrych Zwingli himself is killed in battle outside the city of Zurich. So it doesn't end too well for him, but this is probably not the first and definitely not the last real physical military conflict that arises out of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation will probably see more prejudice and religious bigotry and militarism and death on both sides than almost any other time in Western European history during this particular time period. Let's move on to a much more successful guy from Switzerland. The most important and most successful Swiss reformer was a fellow by the name of John Calvin. John Calvin and his followers were, again, very originally called Calvinists. Now, the cornerstone of Calvinist belief, and again, this is another Protestant faction here, but the cornerstone of Calvinist belief is this idea that God possesses all-encompassing power. And Calvinists believed that God directed everything that happened in the past, that was happening in the present, and that was yet to happen in the future. This belief is what is called predestination. And Calvinists believe that God had already predetermined the fate of every single person. Sinner, saint, success, failure, prince, pauper. And so, a real question for them was, is the world God's plan, or do we exist in free will, or can there be a combination thereof? But largely, they believed in this idea of God's all-encompassing power, and that he had already directed the fate of every single person. Now, John Calvin and his followers, like Zwingli, would ultimately gain control over a city in Switzerland. For Zwingli, it was Zurich. It didn't end well for them, but for the Calvinists, it was the city of Geneva, Switzerland. And in its time, by the time that the Calvinists took over, Geneva, Switzerland was a pretty rough and tumble place. Sort of think about it, kind of a Wild West style town in terms of its lawlessness and things like that. And when the Calvinists came in and took over, they turned this place into a theocracy, and their aim was to clean it up and turn it into a city of God, so to speak. And one of the ways that they did this was through very, very strict rules and standards governing behavior. For example, in the city of Geneva, people were forbidden from doing things like fighting, swearing, drinking, gambling, or, wait for it, dancing. Yes, dancing would have been considered sinful behavior, and as much as all this seems very over the top and incredibly strict, yeah, it probably was. They enforced these rules by doing checks on people's houses at certain times of the year to make sure that you did not have contraband things like, alcohol or gambling paraphernalia or things like that. But they actually cleaned this town up. They really turned it into what outsiders would later call a model city and a city of God. And when outsiders would come to visit the city of Geneva, they were so impressed by what the Calvinists had done there that they wanted to export Calvinism to their own lands. And Calvinism became a very popular form of Protestantism in different parts of Europe, as many people wanted to export that belief and that system, that strict system, to their own lands. It moved into Scotland. Scotland became very Calvinist. Parts of France became very Calvinist. Calvinism even moved to the east. So John Calvin, his followers, and that movement became very successful, not just in Geneva, but their ideology in different parts of Europe. Okay, so last sort of breakaway Protestant group I want to talk about is actually kind of a combination of a number of different groups, and that's called the Anabaptists. So what we see is that in Western Europe, as part of the Protestant Reformation and these breakaway groups, we see a handful of new groups in Western Europe that are really collectively referred to as Anabaptists. The reason that they get this name is because, unlike Catholics who baptize infants, the Anabaptists initiated the practice of baptizing only adult members into their religion, adults only. Okay, and the idea here was that you had to be an adult, you had to make the conscious choice that you wanted to join this religion and be a part of this belief system before you could be initiated into that group. When you're an infant, you don't really have a choice, as the Catholics would do it. But for the Anabaptists, they would initiate or baptize only adult members into their groups. And the Anabaptists believed, and even among Protestants, the Anabaptists were really considered very fringe. People like Zwingli, Calvin, Luther, they kind of had their run-ins with these folks. Anabaptists believed that God was the only true authority on earth, which is fine, but moving forward from that, since God for them was the only true authority on earth, they refused to recognize the authority of anything else. They denied the authority of governments, nobles, kings, elected officials. They refused to hold public office. They refused to swear oaths to anything or anyone. They refused to bear arms and fight. And a lot of Anabaptists believed that society was sinful, that the root of sin was the temptation of society. So what they would do is they would live in these isolated communities that were separated from mainstream cities and mainstream towns, much like the monastic orders of monks and nuns who would live away from mainstream society. And if you haven't figured it out yet, some of the more modern ancestors of the original Anabaptists from the Protestant era of Western Europe are people like the Amish, people like the Mennonites today, who still hold that same kind of lifestyle where they live in these sort of isolated rural communities, separating themselves from mainstream cities and towns. That's what the Anabaptists did. Now, most Anabaptists in Western Europe were peaceful. They were sort of looked upon as an oddity, but they practiced their beliefs peacefully. However, others were very, very fanatical. And the ones who make the most noise are the ones that unfortunately tend to define the whole group for everyone. And as a result of the fanaticism, these different groups of Anabaptists were disliked, not just by Catholics, but also by other Protestants, which created a real problem for them, and they could not find a place in Europe to practice their religion freely. As a result, many Anabaptists actually leave Europe and go to a new open continent by this time called North America in the 1600s. And some of these folks are people that we are familiar with here in the United States. Try the Pilgrims, try Plymouth Rock, the whole Thanksgiving thing. These folks were Anabaptists. I mean, why did the Pilgrims come to the Americas? They were looking for religious freedom. Why? They were persecuted in Europe because they were Anabaptists. So believe it or not, the Protestant Reformation actually has a very big impact on the development of American history. If you can make that connection there. So there we have it for today. We looked at some of the different break-off groups of the Protestant Reformation. Remember, Luther makes his movement, and as a result, we see others breaking away from the Catholic Church as well. We looked at Swiss reformers, Huldrych Zwingli. What did he believe? What was his movement, and where did it all kind of end? Not too well for him. Much more successful Swiss reformer was John Calvin, of course. We looked at the basics of Calvinist belief, predestination, and we saw the success of their reform movement. And then we finished with the Anabaptists, what they believed, sort of the idea of baptizing adult members only, being the ancestors of sort of the modern Amish and Mennonites. And we saw that because of their beliefs, they were persecuted in Europe, and ultimately many of them fled to the Americas during the 1600s, having a big impact on our development and our history here in the United States. So those are the essential questions, folks. Make sure you study them, make sure you know them, be ready to talk about them the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.